Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. I have one little announcement to make, though, before I get started in my remarks to Dr. Stephen, if he's still here. His name was Wayne Wheeler. And the reason I wanted to make that announcement is that as arriving here on Friday, I ran into some lovely folks that are with us from Texas, but they're originally from this area and still have property here. They're in the summit right now, Dr. Stephen, his son Stephen, his wife Jan. And we were talking about the amendment that was repealed to the Constitution. In fact, they said a trivial question, which one was? And of course, my 55-year-old brain didn't know at that particular moment. But when it was the 18th Amendment, the one for prohibition on alcohol, I said, well, did you know that this is a story of a committee of one? What one can do to make a difference. There's one man who made sure that alcohol was abolished out of our society, led that to the point where it even became the 18th Amendment. So, of course, then he wanted to know the name of that person. In my Google search, I found, again, his name is Wayne Wheeler. But what I also found out, Doctor, is that it was a committee of one woman, a Republican woman, who made sure that that was repealed. I am so honored to be a part of your conference today. I've heard about it. I've known John for a while. He's invited me before, and I absolutely am honored to be able to come in and share some conservative principles with you and some of my thoughts and ideas during the same time that President Barack Obama decided he was going to come to the great state of Colorado to remind us of why what we are confronted with this year is so important in this country, how we're extremely divided, and we need some solutions to finally come out of Washington, D.C. to represent our government in a proper fashion the way that we were designed. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Star Parker, as you heard, and for 25 years I've been in public life. Folks who know my story know that as a young woman, I was on welfare. And in fact, my bio did a little justice to say how I ended up there. Frankly, I just believed the lie of the left. I believed that my problems were somebody else's fault, that the poor were poor because the wealthy were wealthy, that America was inherently racist, so why bother to mainstream? This was the voice of all that said that they represented my interests because they wore the same color skin I did, and I bought that lie, the same lie we hear today. It wasn't until after a Christian conversion that I just totally changed my life. I ended up back in college, as you heard. I got a degree and I started a business. And after the '92 Los Angeles riots destroyed my business, I knew I wasn't going back on welfare. I'd by then seen the hand of the Lord work in my life, and so I continued to move forward, and that's how I became more engaged in public policy. A lot of the details of my story are in my book that's available later on during the book signing, Uncle Sam's Plantation. I actually wrote my autobiography as well. I'm not sure that's here. It's called Pimps, Whores, and Welfare Brats, just to give you an idea of the kind of life that I was delivered from. And actually, there are a lot of information that is not in that book because I wasn't sure about statutes of limitations, so I didn't want to end up the rest of my life on jail after working so hard to get to the point where I could serve the Lord. I had opportunity in the 90s to work on welfare reform, and that's when I founded my organization, CURE, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, the policy think tank that looks at market-based solutions to fight poverty. I launched the work of CURE because I knew firsthand that the political promises of entitlement sold into our minority communities caused generations to become pathologically dependent on centralized planning and government programs. I concluded, like most Americans, that we needed people in Washington, D.C., who would fight consistently to restore our founding principles, principles of traditional values, because choice loses its meaning if it doesn't matter what you choose. Principles of limited government, because the role of government is to protect our interests and our property, not to plunder and to pursue it. We needed people in Washington who understood free markets, because profit is not only moral and good, but without profit, there is no capital to invest in tomorrow's interventions and to create jobs. And we also need people in Washington who understand a strong national allegiance and defense. You know, you've heard a lot of discussion about multiculturalism this weekend and the damage that it has done to us as a nation, to balkanize us, to where we have now generations of our youth who do not understand American exceptionalism and the principles of this great country. My life story embodies American exceptionalism, that anyone from any background, any ethnicity, anyone that just needs to be born again and start afresh can begin in this great country of ours. And to realize their dreams. I remember one time I met someone, we were having discussion about the challenges in the Middle East and some of those nations that insist that they hate us. He said, you'll find out how much they really hate us if you walk through the crowds of the mobs with green cards to America, and all of a sudden you'll be swarmed with lines of people that want one. This is a great and exceptional country. But I also have concluded over the last few years of recognizing and understand more about public policy and personal psyche, that this whole notion of redistribution of wealth is inconsistent with the founding of our country. Our country was founded in principles of freedom and personal responsibility. But as well, this idea of redistribution of wealth, socialism itself, is inconsistent with Scripture. When you think about the 10th commandment, it says, do not covet. And socialism is rooted in covetousness. Somebody has something somebody else doesn't have. Covetousness, wanting somebody else's property. Someone has something someone else doesn't have, so we go hire politicians to take it from them. That's theft. Violates another commandment, the 8th, because the IRS is not sending out letters to people saying, how would you like to give to this poverty program so that Star Parker can watch her life unravel into a little dark hole, or so we can continue the zombie of mess that we've made in the 4,000 housing projects that we've set up across this country in the name of helping the poor. No, when the IRS sends you a note to help redistribute your wealth into these so-called poverty programs, it's theft, because they don't give you a choice. They will take you to jail if you say no. Unfortunately, it took economic collapse to get Main Street to start thinking about the state of affairs in our country. And I was very grateful when in 2009, a Tea Party movement arose in our country to talk about socialism, because I'd already talked about socialism in my second book, Uncle Sam's Plantation. 10 years ago, I wrote this book to tell my story of what I saw living inside of welfare and about my transition out. I said in that book that socialism is a reality in every inner city in this country and has been since the Great Society social experiment of the 60s. I talked about the vast sea of perhaps well-intended government programs. Some say they were well-intended. In my research, I'm finding that liberalism is never well-intended. But many of these programs were initially set in motion in the 30s that promised to lift blacks out of poverty. Instead of solving the economics of black, the problems that were result perhaps of created in the history of slavery and Jim Crow, government programs created monstrous moral and social problems in this community. The kind of problems inevitable when individuals turn responsibility of their lives over to others. When you think about what has happened in these communities where they've been convinced that their problems are somebody else's fault and they start to depend on government, we end up with monstrous social problems. The legacy of American socialism is our blighted inner cities, our dysfunctional government-run schools, and our broken black families. I had the privilege of working on welfare reform, as I told you, passed by a Republican Congress and signed into law by a Democrat president. A few years after enactment, we saw the welfare rolls drop in half. I thought then that we were on the road to moving socialism out of our poor black communities and replacing it with wealth-producing American capitalism. I thought truth had won, that all were created equal, and it meant just that. Thus, I began working to promote school choice and personal retirement accounts to help break the cycle of generational poverty. But incredibly, by 2001, we began going in the opposite direction. Power changed political parties, but control stayed in Washington. Government expanded in many areas, but the biggest affront to my work was the faith-based initiative, this multi-billion tax incentive to put America's churches on welfare. By 2008, power changed political parties again, and by 2009, instead of poor America on socialism becoming more like rich America on capitalism very rapidly became like poor America on socialism. Major industries were being just boggled down with government, bailed out, and government controlled. And in fact, it was interesting as these transitions were going on. I'm in Washington. I work there full time. I live in California. People think that's a long commute, but frankly, if you're ever on the 405 freeways in California, you realize that actually flying across country is a lot easier to get your work done than to go up and down that freeway. But as you start seeing the people that were coming back out to Washington, some of the even Christian organizations that had to begin to hire lobbyists to protect their interests, it was incomprehensible what was going on. I'd always been for the underdog, but I never thought the underdog would be bankers and Wall Street executives and doctors and others that needed protection now from the heavy-handed government. Socialism gripped America's poor minority community some 45 years ago, and now, as many are realizing, the social engineering of the political elite in Washington contributed greatly to the cultural and moral collapse and the economic chaos that we are confronted with today in our society. At root of America's fiscal problems is government dependency. Today, 70% of non-defense tax intake is a transfer to individuals. 70% of non-defense tax intake is a transfer to individuals. Today, 47% of Americans are in some way government dependent. Today, 40% of all births are paid for by Medicaid, and Medicaid pays the bills of 60% of all long-term nursing home care. Means-tested welfare programs. The means test, for those that don't know the terminologies out of Washington, D.C., they're the rules that they set up when they're stealing other people's money to just arbitrarily give it away to somebody who might not deserve it. So the rules of welfare are don't work, don't save, don't get married, and we'll kind of keep you enslaved to this poverty plantation. Well, those mean-tested programs are costing American taxpayers about $500 billion federal dollars today and another $200 billion in the states annually. The entitlements that we know need reform, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, are about $700 billion annually now, and unfounded liabilities of about $70 trillion. And some are saying that those are low estimates. When you have 10,000 people every day turning 65 years old, there is no way that we can go on the way that the structures and institutions in this society are right now. When you have 48% making and 47% taking, we're at a crossroads in this wonderful country of ours. I was just talking to my colleague who does most of the research for my organization, CURE, to see what Gallup was saying about the decision on health care this week, what the American people actually are telling Gallup that they are saying, and we're split right down the middle. 46% like it, 46% don't. And what was interesting when the Gallup asked them about repeal, what percentages wanted to repeal 100%, and those numbers are down to about 30%. 70% say that we like some aspects of government control in our lives. There's a lot of work that we need to do, those of us that are in this room, the committee of one. The glaring truth underlying our economic collapse is that liberalism does not work. Uncle Sam's plantation didn't work for blacks, and it won't work for the middle class. In just 50 years, blacks went from 70% of children being raised in married households to 70% of children being raised in single-parent households today. When Reagan became president, 18% of births were outside of marriage. Today, out-of-marriage births are at 40%. Blacks are at 72%, Latinos are at 53%, and whites, while during the 60s were at 3%, today they're just under 30%. We can't go on like this. In the 60s, 75% of American adults were married, compared to around 50% today. When you have social thinkers like Charles Murray, libertarian social thinker who gave us Bell Curve and Losing Ground, coming up with a book called Coming Apart, you know we're in crises. When you have Charles Murray, a libertarian, pointing to the morality of our country, as de Tocqueville did, and marriage and the importance for us to hold ourselves together as a community of people. So the first question we should be asking ourselves when we're looking at political affairs is not how to elect Republicans. The first question we should be asking ourselves is what's wrong with our country? Then we should ask ourselves the answers to these questions. And then we should make sure that those we support for elected office agree with the answers to how we are going to fix the problems that are tearing our country apart.